Winter, 1944. Europe was bleeding. For 5 long years, the war had devoured everything: cities, empires, and millions of lives. The Allies were pushing in from the west after D-Day. The Soviets were closing from the east, and Hitler's Third Reich was collapsing from within. But in those final, desperate months, the Führer still believed he could reverse fate. He called it Wacht am Rhein, the watch on the Rhine. The Allies would call it the Battle of the Bulge. In early December, under the cover of snow and silence, German forces massed along a 130-kilometer front in the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies believed too thick, too cold, and too quiet for a major attack. But that was exactly what Hitler wanted them to think. His plan was bold, even brilliant on paper. Strike through the Ardennes, crush the thinly held American lines, and drive all the way to Antwerp, cutting the Allied armies in two. If he could split the British and Americans, perhaps the Western Allies might sue for peace, allowing him to turn back east against the Soviets. But there was one problem. The Allies had the skies. The Luftwaffe was broken. German tanks couldn't move freely without being torn apart by Allied aircraft. To succeed, Hitler needed more than strength. He needed confusion. That's when Otto Skorzeny entered the picture. Skorzeny was already a legend in Germany, the man who had rescued Mussolini from a mountaintop prison in 1943 using gliders and audacity. Tall, scarred, and ruthlessly intelligent, he was Hitler's favorite commando. The Führer called him "my most dangerous man." In October 1944, Skorzeny was summoned to Hitler's headquarters at the Wolf's Lair. There, amid the smoke of despair and desperation, Hitler outlined a daring new mission: infiltrate American lines during the upcoming offensive. The concept was deceptively simple and utterly unprecedented. Using captured American uniforms, weapons, and vehicles, specially trained German commandos would slip behind enemy lines disguised as U.S. soldiers. Their orders: spread panic, misdirect traffic, flip road signs, sabotage communications, and seize key bridges before the main German assault reached them. The operation was codenamed Greif, meaning Griffin. Hitler imagined it as a psychological dagger, a way to paralyze the Allied command from within. If no one could tell friend from foe, confusion would do what brute force could not. But there were immense challenges. First, the language. Most German soldiers spoke little or no English. Second, authentic materials. They needed real American uniforms, jeeps, papers, even cigarettes. And third, the risk. Any soldier caught in enemy disguise could be executed as a spy. Still, Skorzeny accepted without hesitation. The greater the danger, he said, the greater the honor. He was given command of Panzer Brigade 150, a newly formed unit composed of elite Waffen-SS troops, Fallschirmjäger, and volunteers from other branches. From them, he selected around 150 English-speaking soldiers, trained intensively to mimic American accents, gestures, and slang. They studied Hollywood films, practiced with U.S. rifles, learned American traffic signs and military jargon, even the way Americans smoked, fast and loose. By late November, they began gathering captured Allied equipment. From destroyed vehicles, they salvaged Sherman tanks, jeeps, and M8 armored cars, repainting them with U.S. markings. But there were never enough. Many of the American vehicles were German Panthers crudely disguised with fake stars and olive drab paint. As snow thickened over the Ardennes, the stage was set. The plan was dangerous. The disguise imperfect. The odds nearly impossible. But to Hitler, Operation Greif represented something more than a tactical gamble. It was an act of defiance, a final illusion to make the world believe Germany still had teeth. And on December 16, 1944, before dawn, that illusion came to life. The fog rolled in over the frozen forests. The ground trembled beneath tank tracks. German artillery thundered in the distance. And the Ardennes, long silent, erupted in flame. Thousands of American soldiers awoke to the unimaginable. Hitler's last offensive had begun, and somewhere amid the chaos, wearing their uniforms, speaking their language, Skorzeny's men were already moving. Skorzeny's orders were precise and ruthless. He would not lead a conventional armored thrust. He would forge an army of ghosts, men who looked American, moved American, and for a few dangerous hours were Americans in every visible way. The unit was designated Panzer Brigade 150, but under the codename Operation Greif, it became a laboratory of disguise. Selection began in October and November 1944. Skorzeny dug through the Wehrmacht and SS for anyone fluent in English, men who had lived abroad, men who had been educated in English-speaking schools, former merchant seamen, émigrés, even prisoners of war turned volunteers. Roughly 150 to 200 soldiers were chosen for the heart of the mission. Others would serve in support roles. Many could speak passable English. A smaller number spoke it well enough to pass in the chaos of war. Training was unconventional. Classrooms were makeshift barns and stone buildings in the Reich. Linguists and officers drilled idioms and slang. A man who had never seen a baseball game was taught not just the rules, but the cadence of how an American might say double play or batter up. They practiced salutes, shoulder movements, the casual posture of men who had grown up on U.S. military bases. They watched American newsreels where available and rehearsed answers to everyday questions, the kind of small talk soldiers used to prove each other's authenticity. The disguise extended far beyond speech. Skorzeny requisitioned captured uniforms and equipment from battlefields across France and the Low Countries. Helmets, field jackets, canteens, mess kits, whole piles of Allied kit were cleaned and reissued. When genuine items were scarce, German tailors imitated American uniforms down to the stitching and buttons. Vehicles were especially tricky. Skorzeny's men scavenged jeeps, half-tracks, and armored cars. When they could not obtain real American vehicles, German tanks and armored cars were reshaped and painted with white stars. Some were crude imitations, some were convincing at a distance. Forgery became an art form. Documents, ration cards, and identity papers were produced to a frightening level of detail. Coffee tins were repackaged. Cigarette brands changed to match what an American might carry. Even the small throwaway items, including a baseball glove, a paperback novel, a pack of chewing gum, were assembled to create a believable tableau. Skorzeny divided his men into small teams. Each team had a specific mission. Some would roll ahead to seize and hold key crossroads. Others would cut communications or remove road signs to reroute traffic. Still others were to impersonate spearhead units and lead Allied columns into traps. A handful of operatives were assigned to sabotage, cut telegraph wires, tamper with fuel supplies, and set demolition charges on bridges. Risk was constant and understood. German command made no secret that capture while in enemy uniform carried the gravest consequences. International law did not protect soldiers who fought in the uniform of the enemy. Skorzeny himself warned his men, if you were taken in disguise, the penalty could be death. Yet many accepted the risk. The promise of glory, or simply the momentum of orders in a total war, was enough. Logistics for Operation Greif were immense and improvisational. Fuel had to be thawed and rationed. Radios were adapted to work on Allied frequencies. Maps were prepared that showed not only topography, but the civilian landmarks Americans might reference. The name of a bakery, a bus depot, the shop where someone might buy cigarettes. Timing was absolute. Skorzeny's commando teams were to move in during the opening hours of Hitler's offensive on 16th of December 1944, when confusion was greatest and Allied air power was hampered by winter weather. When the offensive began before dawn that morning, the Ardennes erupted in a single terrible instant. Artillery and mortar barrages masked movement. Tank columns rolled. Infantry followed. Under the veil of that chaos, Greif's team slipped into the thicket of roads, towns, and waysides. Some elements reached their objectives. Bridges were assaulted, signs were turned, and small units infiltrated American areas. For a few hours, the illusion worked. But even at the outset, fissures appeared. A captured radio operator failed to reproduce a common American frequency call. A driver labeled a road by a British term rather than an American one. A quick exchange at a checkpoint revealed a lack of knowledge about the most mundane American habits. The very tools Skorzeny had relied upon, accents, uniforms, props, began to show limits when tested under pressure. The operation's aims were strategic and psychological. Skorzeny hoped the infiltration would amplify the fog of war, turning the Allies' superior coordination into uncertainty. Yet the initial successes were matched by small errors that would grow into suspicion. One mistaken word in a nervous conversation could spread like wildfire down a chain of command. A single unusual behavior could trigger inspections that uncovered more than one imposter. These small missteps, cultural slips, sloppy forgeries, a hesitation in speech, would force Allied commanders to adopt new precautions and redefine trust at a front line where nothing could be taken at face value. The seeds of that paranoia were planted in those first hours of Greif. What followed demanded lenses that could separate human instinct from doctrine, leadership from improvisation, and technology from raw nerve. Angles that would reveal why a baseball question mattered more than a bayonet. War is often described in terms of firepower and tactics, tanks, artillery, bombers. But Skorzeny understood something far deeper. He weaponized trust. For centuries, deception had been a tool of warfare, from Trojan horses to camouflage tanks. Yet rarely had it been deployed so personally, so invasively as in Operation Greif. The uniform, normally a sacred symbol of identity and belonging, was turned into a weapon of psychological warfare. A soldier's greatest comfort at the front was recognizing his own. The shape of the helmet ahead, the accent of a comrade, the insignia on a sleeve. Operation Greif inverted that safety. Every sign of friendship could now conceal danger. The effect was immediate and devastating. In the first 48 hours of the Battle of the Bulge, rumors spread that German infiltrators were everywhere, that they spoke perfect English, that they drove captured jeeps, that they knew every Allied password. Some claimed they were changing road signs. Others swore they were assassinating generals. The paranoia became so intense that checkpoints multiplied, and every jeep was stopped, questioned, and searched. Even before most of Skorzeny's men had been captured, their idea had achieved its goal. It fractured the bond of trust among Allied troops. Soldiers began doubting not just strangers but friends. Skorzeny's brilliance wasn't in the scale of his force. His disguised commandos were a mere few dozen compared to the hundreds of thousands fighting in the Ardennes, but in the psychological disproportion of his tactic. Fear of the unseen enemy did more to slow Allied coordination than many battalions of tanks. Every time a soldier hesitated at a checkpoint or rechecked an order, Skorzeny's invisible influence deepened. The battlefield became a mirror maze of uncertainty, and confusion itself became a weapon. Otto Skorzeny's reputation had already reached mythic levels before the Ardennes. A Viennese engineer turned Waffen-SS commando, he had personally led the 1943 raid that freed Benito Mussolini from captivity atop the Gran Sasso mountain, landing gliders on the rock itself under enemy fire. That mission had made him a celebrity in Nazi Germany and a subject of fear in Allied intelligence. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a dueling scar slicing his cheek, Skorzeny looked every inch the cinematic soldier the propaganda ministry adored. Yet beneath the myth was a strategist who understood the value of imagination in war. He saw the battlefield as theater, where perception could be manipulated as effectively as troop movements. When Hitler proposed the Ardennes deception, few commanders had the nerve or ingenuity to make it happen. Skorzeny, however, had spent years studying Allied methods. He knew how Americans moved, how they spoke, even how they relaxed. To him, deception wasn't dishonorable. It was evolutionary warfare. He once remarked, "Our enemies win by machines. We must win by ideas." Operation Greif was precisely that, an idea forged in desperation, yet the very man who conceived it also understood its limits. In his later writings, Skorzeny admitted he doubted whether the operation could achieve more than temporary confusion. He lacked resources, trained men, and equipment. But Hitler's command was absolute and disobedience was unthinkable, so he gambled. And in that gamble lay a paradox. Skorzeny's legend grew not because the operation succeeded militarily, it did not, but because it revealed the extraordinary psychology of deception in modern war. He proved that fear, rumor, and imagination could disrupt an army more efficiently than artillery. The Ardennes in December 1944 was a place made for confusion. Thick forests, narrow roads, endless fog. It was a natural labyrinth. Visibility was so low that entire battalions sometimes vanished into the mist for hours. Radios crackled and failed. Snow-muffled engines. Night came early, swallowing sound and sight alike. For the Allies, who believed the front was quiet, the sudden explosion of movement on December 16th was disorienting enough. But when word spread that German troops were masquerading as Americans, The fog became psychological. At road junctions, MPs halted every vehicle. Drivers were asked to name the state capital of Illinois, or who played center field for the Brooklyn Dodgers. Soldiers fumbled for answers to questions they'd never thought would matter. Some, genuinely American, failed the tests through nerves or ignorance and were detained until verified. Meanwhile, real infiltrators slipped through because they'd memorized just enough details to survive the first exchange. The line between security and hysteria blurred. The fog of war, usually a metaphor, became literal and lethal. Every patch of forest, every jeep in the distance became suspect. The landscape itself felt haunted by deception. Language, that subtle thread of identity, became a battlefield weapon. Skorzeny men could imitate the sound of English, but not its soul. Their training covered grammar, slang, even gestures, yet real fluency requires instinct, the rhythm of a sentence, the effortless idioms of someone born to the language. It was in small slips that suspicion bloomed. Germans used petrol instead of gas, lorry instead of truck, torch instead of flashlight. Some pronounced American place names with a European inflection. The Americans, sensing something was off, began using conversation as a detection tool. Questions about baseball teams, Hollywood stars, and state capitals became field tests. What began as a clever trick, blending into the enemy, was undone by culture itself. For Skorzeny's men, English was a disguise that couldn't survive stress. For the Americans, the English language became their invisible armor. As suspicion grew, so did the sense that the war had entered a new dimension. One fought not just with bullets, but with identity itself. The stage was set for the next chapter, when both sides realized the deception had spiraled far beyond control. When the first reports reached Allied headquarters that Germans were fighting in American uniforms, disbelief turned to alarm within hours. Military police units were ordered to tighten all checkpoints across Belgium, Luxembourg, and northern France. A new kind of war had begun, one where identity itself was a weapon. The U.S. Army's Counterintelligence Corps, CIC, went into overdrive. Their mission: find and expose infiltrators before they could paralyze command structures. Field manuals were rewritten overnight. New security questions were devised. At every roadblock, troops stopped passing convoys and interrogated drivers, officers, even generals. Questions ranged from geography to pop culture. What's the capital of Illinois? Who won the World Series in 1942? What's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend's name? Soldiers laughed nervously, but the purpose was deadly serious. A single hesitation could mean a German disguised as a friend. The irony was sharp. Many American troops were teenagers, not scholars. Some didn't know the answers themselves. General Omar Bradley was once detained briefly after giving the wrong answer to a baseball question. Even General Eisenhower, the supreme commander himself, was confined to his quarters for several days under heightened security, fearing assassination attempts from disguised infiltrators. This paranoia slowed the Allied advance but likely saved countless lives. In the fog and confusion, trust had become as fragile as glass. Road signs were destroyed, orders delayed, and even medics were stopped for inspection. American soldiers began looking into each other's eyes for proof of loyalty, not the uniform. The psychological cost of Skorzeny's plan was now measured not in lost tanks, but in lost certainty. Angle 6. Moral gray zones. The law of war tested, the discovery of infiltrators forced the Allies to face a grim moral dilemma. Under the Hague Convention of 1907, soldiers caught in enemy uniform could be considered spies and executed after trial. Yet in the chaos of the Ardennes, trial was often a matter of minutes. When German commandos were captured in American gear, U.S. field commanders had to decide instantly: treat them as prisoners of war or enemy spies. Most received summary execution after brief interrogation, usually by firing squad. The line between legality and vengeance blurred under the strain of battle. To the Germans, these men were commandos acting under military orders. To the Americans, they were criminals violating the unwritten code of war, that uniforms signify honesty amid slaughter. For the soldiers carrying out the sentences, it was an unbearable task. Eyewitness accounts describe GIs refusing to watch, others volunteering to shoot quickly to end it cleanly. Even in victory, the act felt dirty. It wasn't war, one American sergeant later said. It was theater turned into murder. These executions also spread fear among Skorzeni's remaining men. Every disguise, every conversation, every glimpse of a jeep in the distance might be their last. Some stripped off their uniforms, others deserted, and a few surrendered, preferring captivity over certain death. The moral fog deepened. Could a soldier condemned for following orders truly be guilty? Or was he just another victim of a war that no longer obeyed its own rules? For the ordinary American soldier, Operation Reich created a nightmare that reached far beyond the front lines. Units that had fought side by side for months now looked at each other with quiet unease. Soldiers began checking dog tags, inspecting personal letters, asking casual questions about hometowns just to reassure themselves. Entire convoys were delayed because a private mispronounced a city's name or stumbled on a slang phrase. Some GIs joked about it to ease tension. Guess I better memorize the Brooklyn Dodgers lineup before roll call. But beneath the laughter was exhaustion. The cold, the artillery, and now doubt, the deadliest weapon of all. Stories spread of Americans being detained by their own MPs. A rumor even claimed that Skorzeny planned to kidnap Eisenhower himself. A rumor so persistent that the Supreme Commander was temporarily confined to his fortified headquarters at Rheims. The paranoia achieved exactly what Skorzeny had hoped: hesitation. Every checkpoint that stopped an American column bought time for German tanks pushing west. The delay helped the 6th Panzer Army seize crucial ground in the early days of the Bulge. But this psychological edge came at a human cost for both sides. The Americans began questioning everything, and the Germans, disguised as Americans, began questioning themselves. Each captured commando knew death awaited, yet some confessed relief when it finally came. For the Allies, the experience left a scar deeper than statistics could measure. It forced them to realize that even the most disciplined army could be shaken not by force, but by doubt, a soldier's most private enemy. At its heart, Operation Grief was not about bridges or maps. It was about the concept of identity itself. What does it mean to belong to a side in war? A uniform, a flag, a password, all could be copied. But the inner language of a man, the memory of his culture, the way he answers a question about home or sport, that could not. The baseball question, simple as it was, symbolized this truth. To a German raised in Vienna or Munich, who won the World Series? Was not just unanswerable, it was alien. The Allied soldiers, mostly boys from Kansas, Ohio, or Texas, carried those cultural codes in their bones. War had turned culture into a fingerprint. The United States' love for baseball, trivial in peace, became a national identifier in battle. It was a reminder that wars are not only fought by machines and armies, but by civilizations and their invisible habits. Operation Greif failed tactically, but it revealed something profound. The enemy could steal your weapons, mimic your words, even wear your colors, but not your essence, and so, from paranoia to execution, from disguise to discovery, the deception reached its breaking point. The illusion was about to collapse violently, decisively, in the moment when American troops finally cornered Skorzeny's infiltrators, and the truth was forced out at gunpoint. December 17, 1944, dawn over the Ardennes. The German offensive was only a day old, and already the forest had become a labyrinth of chaos. Snow whipped through the air, muffling the rumble of tanks and the distant crackle of gunfire. For the Americans stationed along the frozen roads near St. Vith, Elsenborn Ridge, and Malmedy, it felt like the world had turned upside down overnight. And into this confusion rolled the ghosts of Operation Greif. Jeep after jeep, marked with white stars and U.S. serials, appeared out of the mist. Headlights dimmed, windshields iced over. They looked perfectly American. Inside, men in olive drab spoke English with clipped efficiency. They carried Thompson submachine guns, smoked Lucky Strikes, and flashed the right papers. Nothing seemed out of place, until the first wrong turn. Near the crossroads of Honsfeld, a U.S. convoy was redirected by a group of American MPs. They waved traffic toward a narrow side road, straight into an ambush by German armor hidden beyond the trees. Within minutes, trucks were burning, soldiers scrambling for cover. The deception had worked. One false order, one false direction, and entire units vanished into disaster. Elsewhere near Trois Ponts, another team of disguised Germans seized a bridge long enough to blow its supports, delaying the American counterattack by hours. Others switched road signs. Liège pointed toward Bastogne, Bastogne toward nowhere. Communications collapsed. Messages contradicted themselves. The Ardennes became a chessboard where every move could be a trap. Scorzeni's commandos operated in small, self-contained units, usually 4 to 6 men, each with specific objectives. Some were to capture bridges before Allied engineers could destroy them. Others were ordered to infiltrate headquarters areas and spread false rumors that new German divisions had landed behind the lines, that the front had collapsed, that Eisenhower was dead. And for a while, the illusion held. Reports flooded into Allied headquarters. Enemy wearing our uniforms. Enemy driving our jeeps. Signs changed. Bridges blown by our own men. Panic simmered. The fog, both literal and psychological, grew thicker by the hour. But deception has a half-life, and Greif's disguise began to decay faster than expected. One of the first to fall was a sergeant near Iweil, stopped at a checkpoint after being spotted giving a British-style salute. When questioned, he stumbled over an American slang phrase, saying petrol instead of gas. He was detained, searched, and within minutes, his papers were found to be forgeries. Under interrogation, he broke. He confessed to being part of a special unit under SS Obersturmbannführer Otto Skorzeny, sent to disrupt Allied operations behind the lines. The alarm spread instantly. Every checkpoint from Liège to Namur went on red alert. Military police units received shoot-on-sight authority for any suspicious personnel. Radio broadcasts warned all divisions to verify every order, every face, every uniform. By the evening of December 18th, the Americans were no longer just fighting the Wehrmacht. They were fighting the idea of invisibility. Yet Skorzeny's men pressed on. Many still roamed deep inside Allied zones, their missions barely begun. A few reached their objectives. Others, cut off from contact, improvised. One group near Malmedy set up false roadblocks, halting Allied convoys and redirecting them back toward German lines. Another infiltrated an ammunition depot disguised as a maintenance unit. When questioned by suspicious guards, they answered calmly, speaking flawless English, until one of them accidentally called a colonel sir in the wrong tone. Americans rarely used formalities in the field. That tiny detail triggered a search and discovery. Each capture became a chain reaction. The Americans interrogated the prisoners relentlessly. Under pressure, names and routes spilled out, revealing how deep the deception ran. By the third day, the psychological storm was at full force. Soldiers no longer trusted road signs, orders, or even their own officers. In one case, a lieutenant was detained by his own men because he looked too German. Operation Greif had achieved chaos. But it was chaos that soon devoured itself. Many of Skorzeny's disguised teams were cut off as front lines shifted. The same uniforms that had once protected them now marked them for death. They could not approach Americans without risk, and German units, unaware of the deception, often opened fire on them by mistake. The forests of the Ardennes became a place where no one knew who anyone truly was. The deception had begun as strategy. Now it was a curse. Still, amid the unraveling, Skorzeny's men continued to fight. Some died in their disguises. Others were captured, interrogated, and executed. But a few made it out, ghosts fading back into the snow. By December 19th, the American counterintelligence network had begun to close its grip. The first interrogations revealed the truth. This wasn't just random infiltration. It was a planned operation led by Hitler's favorite commando. And with that revelation, the Allies shifted from confusion to vengeance. The fog of deception was lifting. The hunted had become the hunted, and the moment of reckoning was approaching. December 19th at 1944, the trap closes. The first light of dawn revealed a forest littered with wrecks and confusion. American MPs stood shivering at checkpoints, rifles loaded, faces drawn with fatigue. They weren't just guarding roads anymore. They were guarding the truth. Every jeep, every convoy, every soldier that passed through had to prove one thing, that they were who they claimed to be. And so began the great interrogation of the Ardennes. At crossroads and bridges, along icy ridges and muddy trails, soldiers were pulled over and grilled with questions no spy could have memorized. It wasn't about military passwords or serial numbers anymore. It was about American life itself. Who won the World Series last year? What's the capital of Illinois? Who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? What's a touchdown worth? To the Germans, these questions were traps buried in the fabric of culture. To the Americans, they were proof of belonging. One nervous corporal forgot who played shortstop for the Yankees and spent 2 days under armed guard. Another major, genuinely American, nearly got shot because he called gas petrol. The paranoia spread faster than the cold, but behind the tension, something remarkable happened. Order began to return. The deception that once clouded every mind was now being hunted with precision. The Americans were adapting, evolving under fire. Each captured infiltrator revealed more. Some confessed quickly, others stubbornly. Most were terrified. They were commandos, not trained spies, thrust into a game they barely understood. Many spoke English, but their idioms betrayed them. When asked to spell Jeep, one wrote Jeep. Another pronounced Chicago with a hard ch, tiny cracks that gave away a massive lie. By December 20th, Allied intelligence had pieced together the operation structure. The prisoners spoke of a man, Otto Skorzeny, the same commando who had rescued Mussolini from a mountaintop fortress a year earlier. They described how he had gathered English-speaking volunteers, trained them at a secret camp near Friedenthal, and drilled them in American slang, signals, and customs. The Allies were stunned. Not only had Skorzeny's men managed to infiltrate their lines, but they'd done so disguised as them. Under the laws of war, that was a hanging offense. General Omar Bradley, furious but fascinated, declared, "This is war on a new level, a psychological front line." And he was right. The fear of infiltration soon outgrew the infiltrators themselves. Commanders were detained, couriers delayed, supply convoys misdirected by their own side's suspicion. Eisenhower himself became a target of paranoia. Intelligence warned that Skorzeny's men might be trying to capture or assassinate him. For days, the supreme commander of Allied forces was kept under heavy guard. His movements restricted, his location classified. Eisenhower, half amused and half irritated, later wrote, "I was probably the most closely guarded man in Europe that week." Meanwhile, in the snowy woods and frozen villages, the net was tightening. Small groups of Skorzeny's men, cut off from command, tried to retreat east. Most never made it. American patrols swept the forests, searching jeeps, tearing open uniforms, checking boots for German makers' marks. Near Elsenborn Ridge, one captured soldier, barely 20, broke down crying. "I didn't want this," he told his interrogators. "They said it would be easy. We were told we'd go home heroes." For some, it would end far darker. By December 22nd, over 100 suspected infiltrators had been captured. Dozens were tried on the spot. A few were summarily executed, hanged or shot as spies in uniform. It was brutal, but under wartime law entirely legal. The Geneva Convention offered no protection for deception of this kind. And yet, the plan had worked, in its own twisted way. Though Skorzeny's men had failed to achieve their grand objectives, seizing bridges or assassinating leaders, they had achieved the one thing Hitler wanted most: confusion for days. The American advance slowed. Entire divisions were delayed. The Battle of the Bulge gained critical hours for the German counteroffensive, but Skorzeny himself knew the truth. His operation had burned bright and burned out fast. His men had been brave, but the disguise that once protected them had turned into a death sentence. As word spread of their capture and execution, the legend of Operation Greif began to grow, whispered in foxholes, printed in newspapers, and retold by soldiers who had seen Germans dressed as us. Soon it became myth, half truth, half terror, and at its center was one question, the question that gave them away. Who won the World Series last year? That single line, tossed out by a sharp-eyed MP, would echo through history as one of the most iconic moments of wartime deception ever recorded. The game of shadows was over. The snow would melt, the battle would end, and justice of a sort was coming. Early 1945, the smoke settles. When the guns fell silent over the Ardennes, the forests were left scarred, torn by tank treads, shrapnel, and blood. The Battle of the Bulge had become Hitler's last gamble, and his greatest failure. Over 80,000 American casualties, more than 100,000 German losses, towns obliterated, fields frozen with bodies, and morale tested to its edge. Among the thousands of German prisoners marched westward, there was one man the Allies wanted above all: Otto Skorzeny, the architect of the deception that had thrown entire American divisions into chaos. He had survived the offensive. While his unit, Panzer Brigade 150, had been shattered, Skorzeny himself managed to withdraw east, evading capture for months. But by May 1945, as the Third Reich collapsed and Berlin burned, he surrendered voluntarily to U.S. forces in Salzburg, Austria. He was calm, confident, almost defiant. "I am a soldier," he told his captors, "not a spy." But not everyone agreed. In the months that followed, stories about Germans in U.S. uniforms became legend among returning soldiers. They were the ghosts of the Ardennes, a symbol of deception, fear, and cunning. To the press, Skorzeny was the master of disguise, the man with the scar, the most dangerous commando of the war. To the Allies, he was something else, a criminal who had broken every rule of warfare. By August 1947, Otto Skorzeny stood trial before a U.S. military tribunal at Dachau, charged with violating the laws and customs of war. The prosecution accused him of ordering his men to fight in the uniforms of the enemy, a capital offense under the Hague Convention. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Dozens of captured Germans admitted they'd worn American uniforms during the Battle of the Bulge. Some were even executed for it, but Skorzeny didn't deny it. Instead, he offered a startling defense, one that would change how the world defined espionage and warfare. He argued that his men had worn enemy uniforms only for infiltration, not for combat. They used them to reach objectives, redirect traffic, and cause confusion. But once fighting began, they switched back to their German uniforms. "It is deception," he told the court, "not treachery." Then came the unexpected twist in his defense. British officers, including FFE Yo Thomas, a decorated SOE agent, testified on his behalf. They confirmed that Allied forces, too, had occasionally used enemy uniforms for similar operations, a tactic of necessity, not evil. The testimony stunned the court. Here stood Britain's own spies defending a Nazi commando. But they weren't defending his cause, or they were defending the code of soldiers, the thin gray line between cunning and crime. On September 9, 1947, the tribunal reached its verdict. Otto Skorzeny was acquitted. The judges ruled that while his methods were deceptive, they were not criminal, as long as no combat was conducted under disguise. He had walked the razor's edge of wartime law and survived it. To many Americans, the decision felt wrong. To the Germans, it was vindication. To historians, it became a landmark. Operation Greif and Skorzeny's trial had forced the world to define what was fair in war. Where the line ended between strategy and deception, ruse and betrayal. But Skorzeny himself was not finished. After the war, he would escape from prison, vanish across Europe, and live a life that blurred the lines between soldier, mercenary, and myth. Still, the question that had unmasked his men, who won the World Series, would outlive him. It became a symbol of how a single question, rooted in culture rather than combat, had unmade one of the most daring infiltration operations in history. In the Ardennes, the battle had been fought with tanks and artillery, but in the minds of the soldiers, it had been fought with doubt, and that doubt, invisible, silent, corrosive, had become the deadliest weapon of all. Europe, post-1947, the war was over, but the legends had only begun. After his acquittal at Dachau, Otto Skorzeny was transferred to an internment camp for further denazification hearings. He was now a free man in name, but not in fate. The Allies feared what he represented, not just as an individual, but as a symbol of what German ingenuity and audacity could achieve even in defeat. For months, he waited behind barbed wire in Darmstadt prison, guarded by men who once studied his tactics in training manuals. In July 1948, realizing the next tribunal might not be as forgiving, Skorzeny made a decision worthy of the legend his enemies had already written for him. He escaped, dressed in a stolen U.S. Army uniform, irony at its sharpest. He simply walked past the guards one summer afternoon and disappeared into the ruins of post-war Germany. For years, rumors swirled about his whereabouts. Some said he fled through the Alps. Others claimed he hid in Bavaria, aided by sympathizers within the SS underground. By the early 1950s, intelligence services traced him to Spain, living under the protection of General Francisco Franco. There, the once scarred commando reinvented himself as a businessman and, quietly, a consultant to military circles across Europe and the Middle East. Skorzeny began publishing memoirs, granting interviews, and crafting the image of a pragmatic soldier who had served Germany, not Nazism. But behind the public facade, he reportedly advised several secret operations, including early Egyptian intelligence efforts and the formation of post-war paramilitary networks during the Cold War. Western intelligence agencies watched him closely, yet some also used his expertise. His knowledge of infiltration, psychological warfare, and unconventional tactics became the foundation of what would later be known as Special Operations Doctrine, the same kind used decades later by NATO, the CIA, and elite commando units across the world. It was the ultimate paradox. The man once branded a war criminal had helped define the art of modern covert warfare. But the myth of Operation Greif and the baseball question lived on in a different way. In American barracks from Korea to Vietnam, soldiers told the story of the German GIs. It became campfire legend, a reminder that in war even uniforms could lie. Military intelligence schools began teaching counter-deception protocols directly inspired by the Ardennes incident. Questions about baseball, football, or American slang became official field checks in later conflicts. By the 1960s, Operation Greif was studied not as treachery, but as a case study in psychological warfare. The lessons were sobering. A few dozen men, armed with deception and confidence, had managed to delay entire divisions and sow fear in tens of thousands. Skorzeny, meanwhile, faded into semi-retirement in Madrid, running an engineering firm and occasionally surfacing in Cold War whispers, sometimes accused of helping Nazi fugitives, sometimes rumored to be cooperating with Mossad against ex-SS men. None of it was ever conclusively proven. He died in July 1975 at age 67, reportedly still proud of the scar that marked him as a soldier. His funeral drew veterans, admirers, and the curious, men who had once fought against him, now standing beside those who had served under him. Even in death, Otto Skorzeny remained what he had always been, a contradiction carved into history. But beyond the man himself, it was the idea he embodied that endured. Operation Greif had proven that war wasn't only about firepower or fortitude, it was about perception, about who could control the mind of the battlefield. One baseball question, a symbol of cultural identity and human instinct, had undone an army of deceivers. And in that irony lay the deepest truth of all. No disguise, no uniform, no clever imitation could replace what made a soldier real. The Americans didn't win that psychological war with guns. They won it with belonging, the simple, invisible bond of home. As snow melted from the Ardennes and spring returned to Europe, that bond outlasted every deception, and the world entered a new era of warfare, one that would no longer just target armies, but belief itself. The snow of the Ardennes melted long ago, but its ghosts never left. Operation Greif was not remembered for the ground it gained, or the bridges it took, but for the uncertainty it unleashed. It was a mirror held up to the chaos of war, showing how fragile trust can become when the enemy learns to look like you, speak like you, and walk in your shadow. For the soldiers who fought in December 1944, the battlefield wasn't just the frozen forest. It was inside their own minds. Every checkpoint, every question, every nervous glance carried the same fear, that the man beside them might not be who he claimed to be. And yet, amid that fear, something unbreakable emerged: identity. It wasn't the uniform that defined a soldier, nor the insignia stitched to his sleeve. It was memory on the small human truths no enemy could copy. The way he spoke about baseball, the way he swore when the cold bit his fingers, the way he remembered home. In the end, that was what won. Skorzeny's deception collapsed not because of better guns or greater numbers, but because the human heart could not be counterfeited. The men who asked, "Who won the World Series?" weren't playing games. They were defending something far deeper than lines on a map. They were defending the soul of recognition, the bond between those who belong and those who pretend. From that snowy ruse in 1944 grew the modern face of psychological warfare, the war for minds, for trust, for perception. Today, in a world of digital shadows and invisible fronts, its lessons remain chillingly relevant, because whether on a battlefield or a screen, deception still wears a friendly face, and the truth, as it was in the Ardennes, still depends on those who can tell the difference. The war ended. The world moved on. But the question remains echoing softly through history's snow: who won the World Series?